Okay, let's get going. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the launch of a new AmCham Singapore series called America Through the Eyes of. And the premise of this series is really in the spirit of feedback. And I think all of us who are working in jobs know how much we both despise and need feedback. And so this series is about America getting some feedback from people who are not necessarily American, but could be. And the whole idea is to get different points of view so we have some self-awareness and an understanding of possibly ways to improve, because that's what America is all about, striving to improve. Now, of course, you can also give me feedback, but buy me a drink first, and then we'll talk. So today we're going to be talking about America, and I'm so pleased to welcome Nirmal Ghosh, former U.S. Bureau Chief at the Straits Times. And he's still there, by the way. SPA is doing a podcast, and I'm sure he'll tell us about it. But Nirmal was in the U.S. for decades. And actually, that might be more time than I personally lived in the U.S. at this point, because I was an immigrant to the U.S. from Taiwan when I was 7 years old. And I lived there until I married a Singaporean in my early 20s. And after finishing my PhD in the mid to late 1990s, I left the US in 98 and joined my husband, Singaporean husband, and we lived in a number of different places and now in Singapore for 16 years. So I think, Nirmal, you might have lived in the US for a total number of years longer than me.
Oh, no, I lived for 7 years. 7 years in the US.
7 years. Okay, all right. So I think I still got you beat then. I lived there long enough to give my children US citizenship. So that's pretty important. So today's a conversation, and just to let you know, we're trying something new. We're on LinkedIn Live for the first half of the conversation. And then the second half of the conversation, we'll make it a little bit more intimate and conversational. So then we'll turn off the LinkedIn Live. And for those of you who have joined us through Zoom, we'll be able to take questions and answers and have conversations. And that is the whole point of this thing, so that we can learn more about what Nirmal thinks through his eyes about the United States of America. So at this point in time, I'd like to invite Nirmal to share with us his initial thoughts, and then we're going to probe more about what he really thinks about the United States. Nirmal, welcome to America Through the Eyes of Nirmal Ghosh.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I was in the States for 7 years. I just left. Prior to that, I was in Bangkok for 13 years. Prior to that, Delhi for 3 years, and prior to that, Manila for 5 years. So 30 years as a foreign correspondent, ending up in DC. And I should say that, I don't, obviously, the usual caveat, I don't represent the Straits Times. I don't speak for the Straits Times. I speak entirely for myself. But anyway, thank you for having me. I accepted with some trepidation, frankly, because this is such a distinguished and well-informed audience. But really, as you said, what's happening in America does affect much of the rest of the world, and it is important to talk about it, to understand it. And besides, it's difficult to say no to you, Dr. Lei. So here I am, albeit at a safe distance. I'm at a farm, actually, and you might hear the odd rooster or dog barking, but I have my noise suppression on, so hopefully it won't be too bad. So anyway, just a few quick points, really, maybe to serve as triggers for a subsequent conversation. Bottom line is, as a foreign correspondent, of course, it is important not to have expectations of any country one is covering. So I approached the US as I would any country, Thailand or Japan or Zimbabwe, Nepal. You take it as it is, not as you would like it to be. And this is particularly challenging in the context of the US because American soft power, American culture, from hamburgers to literature to music to entertainment, has been so much a part of our lives, even if we grew up outside the US as I did. But you just cannot go native, as it were. Of course, you can write opinions and commentaries, and you express your beliefs or whatever in those. But in your reporting, you report, and in your analysis, you interpret, contextualize, and analyze, and that's it. So I realized quite quickly that politically, it is more useful to see the United States as 50 different countries. And some of the states, as we well know, are among the largest economies in the world in their own right. I don't think the average outsider or tourist quite gets this. At best, tourists may visit big cities like New York or San Francisco or Chicago, or visit their families. Their kids may be in university towns, maybe go and see Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. You know what I mean? But do they ever stop in so-called flyover country, middle America, the Midwest? And related to this, outside America, most people consume American media and mostly the big cable TV channels. And the media amps up events, which can be misleading. But America is such a vast and decentralized place that while downtown Portland may be burning, and certainly that is a very big deal, the rest of the country is fine. And there is a lot of theater. Government shutdowns are a prime example. If you were to hang on to every word on the cable TV channels, you would think the US is on the verge of a real existential crisis. But we have to always resist the temptation to join in that chorus. And it's the same with politics. I remember in the second year, I think, of the Trump administration, an ambassador from a Southeast Asian country came back from the capital. And when I asked what the opinion was of the states at headquarters, this ambassador said, they think Trump is not going to last another 6 months. He's going to be thrown out of office. I said, why? And the ambassador said, because they only watch CNN. So, that's the picture you get if you follow some of this media. So personally, I operated with some constraints. I managed to get out quite a bit to Kentucky in the dead of winter, to Deer Island, Maine, where I hung out with the lobstermen. I went out at night with former gang leaders cruising Chicago's West Side, where these former convicts work as street intervention specialists for an NGO. They try to ensure youngsters stay out of trouble. I visited the so-called zombie street in Philadelphia, where the opioid and fentanyl addicts hang out. Tragic, really tragic and depressing. The toll that opioids and fentanyl is taking on Americans, it's really awful. It was depressing. As journalists, we have to cover the underbelly, not just the shiny bits and the high-profile political theater. But I did have some budget constraints. If you step out of DC for any overnight trip of any distance, you easily spend about $1,000 to right off the bat. So being a solo correspondent, or at best with one colleague, I did not have the luxury of, say, disappearing into the Midwest for a fortnight to come out with a long form piece. We just can't do that. Coming to the political and cultural environment, there is definitely a shrinking space for civil discourse. The environment is thick with myths and disinformation. Most of the media is biased one way or the other. I've often told friends it's like walking in a blizzard. You must keep your eyes on the path. It's exhausting because of the nature of America it's one of near constant ferment of ideas, of competition, and so forth. And in the political divide, there is an almost visceral fear and loathing for the other side among ordinary people. I remember seeing a tweet, I think it was probably in 2017, from someone who appeared to be a young woman saying, OMG, my Uber driver has a MAGA cap on the seat next to him, and I sent my route to my family in case something was to happen to me. And I found that really, extraordinary. And I've talked to Trump supporters who have asked me very earnestly, so do you talk to the other side? What do they think of us? Do they think we're racist? So, there is this huge divide and suspicion. Yale law professor Amy Chua, who famously wrote the Tiger Mom book, but many others besides, in one of my interviews with her, made the point that America's political divide is beginning to resemble other countries' ethnic divisions. If you look at dating sites, for example, and at neighborhoods, those of a particular political persuasion flock together. They very rarely mingle. You have to have your social antennae up when you meet strangers. And that is a dangerous trend which does not augur well and will test democratic rights and checks and balances and tolerance to the max in the years to come. I should mention guns at some point. We had a shooting just a couple of days ago. So this happens so frequently that it is something which people always notice and hear about. Most of the world does not understand American gun culture. And in fact, polls show that the majority of Americans want more gun control. It just doesn't happen. So most of the world does not understand how children can be killed by random gunmen, and America can't or doesn't do anything about it. America to outsiders, I find is an exciting place. It's shiny. It's a land of freedom and opportunity, of innovation, egalitarian. I remember a Yemeni refugee in Michigan who told me, despite all the problems, despite Islamophobia and all that, he said, America still has justice. And I thought that was a very important thing. But it's also a very scary place. My own take is that guns are part of the DNA of America. And I have written this. If you go to the NRA's gun museum in Virginia, it's a shrine to guns. There's one section for guns used in Hollywood, from John Wayne to Clint Eastwood to Bruce Willis. And how many of us have happily consumed American films with all their violence, all their tropes? And this is a country where being an outlaw with a heart of gold is almost celebrated. Freedom is a talisman, from Bonnie and Clyde to Thelma and Louise, and we have all partaken of that culture. As to the upcoming election, well, the phrase uncharted waters is overused, but in this case, it is definitely appropriate. We have two elderly men, whom polls show Americans don't really want to be running. On current numbers, Donald Trump has the momentum, but margins in critical swing states are razor thin. Of course, any talk of the months to come must come laden with giant caveats, because literally anything could happen. You can read one poll today which shows that one poll yesterday showed that Joe Biden has the edge over Donald Trump. Others show Trump has the edge. So literally anything could happen. Nonetheless, this does come at a time when democracy has been exposed as fragile. Now, January 6, 2020 was the point where everyone realized just how fragile. It took something like 25,000 National Guard troops to ensure a peaceful transition. And this was Washington, D.C. This wasn't Phnom Penh. And the more I think about it, the more I thought about it, I saw January 6 certainly as a turning point, but more importantly, potentially a beginning. And that's the scary thought, but really it could just be the beginning. If the 2019 election was crucial, this one is even more so. And even more so will be 2028, when the next generation will be in play. In a system so decentralized, with so many checks and balances, such a vast country, any actual conflict will take time to manifest on anything like a nationwide scale. But if and when it does, it will be very serious indeed. It will dwarf other internal conflicts. Most of the population is armed. So we are approaching a real crossroads, and there will most certainly be implications for foreign policy as well for the rest of the world. The rest of the world is aware of this. Europe is very much aware of it. You see a lot of commentary now about, what the future of NATO may be if Donald Trump comes back to power. And the rest of the world will have to deal with it, and frankly is considering how it would deal with it. So I think maybe I should stop there and leave some room for, Q&A and whatnot. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Nirmal. That was quite a wide coverage of the complexity and the depth of the United States, which I think is hard for people to grasp. There are 50 states. We all have different characters. I have to confess to everyone, I am from Northern California. So we have a certain view of things and a certain way that we behave. And it's true for every state within the United States. I don't want this to turn into a complete conversation about politics and the election and whatever, but I have to think as an American that no matter which election it is, whether it's 2024, whether it's 2028, I just want to remind everybody that every election is important. We have about 50 elections happening around the world this year, and every election is important. Every vote is important. And so for some countries, like the US, where you can opt in or out of voting, and it is kind of a tedious process, isn't it? Especially for those of us who are overseas. I just want to remind everyone how important it is for you to vote and take care of that business. I'm going to be a little selfish since I'm Asian American. And back in November, Nirmal, you wrote quite a long piece about it. The focus really was around Asian hate. And it just touched me so deeply because during the pandemic, I had become really quite worried about what was going on, especially when I think about my family and friends, and my son is now in university in California, near family as well. And your article in November spoke to the rise of the Asian American voter, the Asian American political candidates, because if we are not represented, there will be no way for us to change the system and ensure that Asian hate and discrimination, which has been in place for centuries, let's not pretend that it's something new, that unless we are also in positions where we can influence change, that it will not come. Tell us about that story, because I would have to say about 75% of the story was around the fear, the hate, the centuries of, the decades and decades of discrimination and the non-recognition. How did you feel? I mean, you are not Chinese American, but you're Asian American, and seeing America suddenly with this minority population rising up, what was that process like? It so touched me, that story, that I wrote you an email about it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that was very disturbing. It started, of course, as you say, it has a long history, but it was exacerbated during the COVID pandemic. And a lot of friends of mine, Asian American friends of mine, specifically Chinese American or Japanese American, even because as you know, it's sometimes to the unschooled eye, sort of everybody just looks like the other, and you stereotype people. They had experiences of nasty experiences, and it was sad because it came as a wake up call, and it showed the power that fear has, I think, in a population. If you inject fear into a population, fear of the other, it's very easy for a population to regress into a so-called secure zone and think of everybody else as the other. The other is always the threat. The other is the sort of the fifth column inside the US, which is bringing all kinds of things. And the fear of immigration is continually being stoked. Immigrants, but even whether it's Latino immigrants from across the border in Mexico, or whether it's Asian or Islamic or whatever. And I do think that things have improved since then, but it's never far below the surface. And that is the worrying aspect. All it takes is a little bit of stoking of fear. And we see this. You see this in other countries as well. It's a human problem. It's not an America deals with it in a more transparent way. I mean, there are more avenues to challenge it and to deal with it in America than in many other countries. But it is I see it as a human failing. A majority population will, at some point, if that fear is stoked, if insecurity is stoked, if things are not doing that well in a country, will go back and will revert to old methods, old behavior of like suspicion of outsiders and whatnot. It's unfortunately very easy to appeal to those baser instincts in humans.
The right to vote and the right to bear arms, all of that are part of our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights, all of that. And I think folks outside of the US can find it very confusing. Even the way we elect our presidents, just blows your mind how it works. And we do have a couple of comments on LinkedIn around our rights. And I like that comment, actually. And people might think it's controversial because so the comment on LinkedIn said, our Second Amendment rights are the reason we have all our other rights. Well, I don't know if it's so directional or causal, but I do agree that the rights that we have in the United States is what defines the United States. And we can debate about which rights we need to even have added. Hello, let's talk about women's rights. Okay, we won't, because that'll take up the whole time for me. But how do you feel, Nirmal, about the fact that we constantly in the United States talk about our right to do certain things? I don't really feel that I hear citizens of other countries talk about it, but I'm really glad that we can say these kinds of things and recognize that, as citizens of the United States, we have certain rights that can be up for debate.
Yeah, no, I think that's a remarkable feature of the American system. But a downside of it is that Americans generally think that this is the model, this is the ultimate democracy, rights, and so forth. In fact, I had an interesting experience. Some years ago, I was on a fellowship, and we had a little session at a university. I can't remember which university it was, with a very well-known professor. And he talked to about 9 of us from Asia, and we were talking about democracy. And then at the end of it, he said, "It's been very refreshing talking to you." So I thought that was a strange comment. I said, "Why?" He said, "I give my freshman class a paper to write, compare the presidential system to the parliamentary system." And he said 90% of them give me a paper comparing the parliamentary system to democracy. So they implicitly believe that the American way, the American system is the pinnacle of democracy, is the only way to be, right? So that is the sort of the downside of it. But I think on balance, I mean, there's very little recognition that there are actually other countries in the world which also have plenty of rights. You know, I mean, look at the Nordic countries, for example, Europe. There are many countries which have, comparable rights and freedom of speech. Although, I mean, we could talk about it all day. There are obviously hybrid countries. There are even common in our region. There are kingdoms, democracies, communist countries. So there is that that range. But yes, in America, there's always this competition of ideas. There's always a competition. There's always a sense of one's rights, and the incredible transparency of the system. It's very impressive. I have to say, it's very impressive. However much noise it creates, it does seem to eventually work. In a country as vast as America, the size of a continent, as again, going back to what I said, like 50 different countries, I think books have been written about this. Eventually, it finds an equilibrium. There is a way out, there is justice, and there are rights to every citizen. It finds an equilibrium, but not without a lot of strife, a lot of even violence. I mean, as we know, right? I mean, the Black Lives Matter reaction to what happened to the police brutality and so forth. It's America periodically goes through a sort of constant level of some trauma somewhere, and occasionally it bursts forth, and it only it bursts forth because people are conscious of their rights, which is, I think, a good thing.
Yeah. Your use of the word trauma is so apt, because when we were thinking about going through the COVID pandemic, I mean, we're all going through some kind of trauma. And then to have incidents like Black Lives Matter happen during that time, I mean, I think it was also a combination of things, the environment that we have been operating in. And even now, as we've exited in some ways out of the pandemic, and y'all know I'm not going to go on a public health rant about how there's a pandemic around the corner, so we should still be careful. But at the same time, the thought that we have unprocessed trauma likely, and that I hope that through these conversations that we're having with you, Nirmal, and others, special guests that are come along, that we have as a collective group processed some of the trauma, because we need to recognize that everybody's gone through something. So we do have some other comments. Clark is asking about younger generations of Singaporeans and Asians about American exceptionalism, if people even think about America in a certain way, especially if they're under the age of 25. Now, Nirmal, I know you're under the age of 25, but I am not. So I may not be able to really think in this way, although I have two kids. He says, if you are under the age of 25, the America that you know includes 9/11, the war in Middle East, global financial crisis, all these things, President Trump, vaccinations and COVID and the uneven distribution access. I mean, it's a tough world, right? And there are people who comment about how the world that we came to live in after World War II, that world is starting to go away, this rule-based order and whatnot. Do you have this view that we're entering into another era that's just completely different than what we've been living through for many decades?
Yes, I think so. And I think American exceptionalism has taken a dent. The idea of American exceptionalism has somewhat tarnished in recent years. With the global explosion of information, with what's going on in the Middle East, with well, I mean, you could carry on and on, but the idea of American exceptionalism has become, to a lot of people around the world, a little tiresome and a little sort of tarnished, I would say, around the edges, because they see America. If you look at American foreign policy, it's very interesting. America sees the world, and it is not my words. These are from foreign policy experts whom I respect in America. America sees the world as a series of problems that need to be fixed. That we can go out and fix this and fix that, and then there'll be stability, and the whole environment will favor America. which is fine, but it doesn't. It's a very binary view. It's not. It's funny. I was talking to someone from Southeast Asia, and I was relating this, and they said, "I wish we had more of that in Southeast Asia, that attitude." But that American attitude doesn't sit well. Again, going back to the what I said about the mosaic we have in this region, Southeast Asia. When President Biden's idea of authoritarianism versus democracy, and that sort of rhetoric has slowly gone away, by the way, in recent months. But a couple of years ago, he was on about it. It didn't find many takers in this part of the world where you have a pluralism and a sort of organic kind of pluralism and a way of approaching problems, which is not like this way or that way, but you live with the problem, you go around it, you manage it. If you cannot solve it, you go around it, you manage it somehow. You can even manage a paradox. So I think that the idea that the sort of the zeal with which America promotes itself, its idea of democracy, free market, liberalism, etc., around the world, and the way it approaches that problems, the sort of fix-it approach, which comes out of a very robust can-do attitude, which is a good thing about America, but it just doesn't work in other cultures. So I find that that sort of people find that a bit tiresome. Young people will continue. America has tremendous soft power. All the polls you see among Asians in Asia, America has tremendous soft power, and it has a reservoir of goodwill. Asian elites will still send their kids to the best American universities. Yes, they do send them to the UK, to Australia, a little bit to Europe, but American universities are still the best. And Asian elites will still send their kids to America. So America has a tremendous amount of soft power, but the way America conducts itself sometimes around the world, grates on other cultures and other societies.
I'm smiling so hard because first, thank you for some of the super nice things that you've said about the US, but I'm also laughing at myself because, part of this whole series is me getting therapy. I'm doing public therapy with y'all and doing some confessions. I was raised in the US. I do have this American can-do attitude, like, can it be, right? Let's do this. And, but I am also extremely American in many ways, which people like to point out to me, to the point where I can be quite blind to the fact that it's not always so easy for people to accept who I am, or how I behave. And so I was in a leadership session, getting to know some very senior leaders. And a few days into this week of leadership training, one of the leaders, who is from one of the Southeast Asia countries, he's a bit older than me. He told me that when he first met me, quote unquote, he could not accept me. And I thought, is this because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm a little bit younger? What is the deal? But it was because of the way I am, what I think of myself as my Americanness, the outspokenness, the sort of the extroversion, all of that. And it was a reminder to me that culturally being American is not always like, yay, you're American, you're so cool. No. And even within the United States, we have different cultures and different ways of thinking, as some of the comments that are coming up. And I have to remind myself that although I have my own views, I need to embrace and understand. Well, embrace might be a little too strong, but at least try to understand other people's points of view, because when you go in thinking you're the coolest cat in the room, you're not really all that open to hearing about other people who you think are not as cool as you. So thank you for some of the comments that have been coming through on LinkedIn. Really appreciate that you might have a different point of view, because that's what this whole series is all about. Now, what I'm going to do now is close off the public portion of this conversation so we can have a more intimate conversation with those who signed up using Zoom. So for those of you who only joined us on LinkedIn Live, when we do this again in a few weeks' time, please do register online so you can get in on the conversation that we're about to close off, just for those folks who logged in through Zoom. Because I kind of think, like, if you do everything on LinkedIn Live, it's a bit too much. But before we go, I want to do something really fun with Nirmal. He does not know what I'm going to ask him, but it's meant to be fun. Just 3 quick questions, one of those rapid fire questions. And so Nirmal, fill in the blank, okay? So the first question is, my favorite American food is?
Fried chicken. Not Kentucky
Chicken,
Fried
yeah,
Chicken.
good
But
choice.
fried chicken. Yeah.
Nice, nice. Okay, second one is the most interesting American celebrity is.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one. Oh God.
Who comes to mind first?
Well, I mean, it's only because top of mind is Taylor Swift because she's been around.
That
But yeah,
works. We have a lot of
I think it
Swifties amongst
works.
us.
Yeah, it works.
Okay, cool. I'll tell you what mine is right now. I always have the celebrity of the moment in my head, Arnold Schwarzenegger, because he just published this amazing book and he has this documentary on Netflix. I highly recommend. Anyway, okay, it's not about me, it's about you. Okay, last one. The best thing about America is.
Big skies, the wide open spaces.
Awesome. Thank you so much. For those of you joining us on LinkedIn Live, we'll look forward to seeing you again next time. We're now going to close off LinkedIn Live and move into the more private portion that will be for those who logged in on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.